At 40, the billionaire had never been kissed until a woman knocked on his door in the storm. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The wind howled across the cliffs like a living thing, thrashing the ocean into white foam. Rain battered against the glass walls of the Vale Mansion, an isolated fortress overlooking the stormy coastline of Maine. Inside, Ethan Vale sat alone in his library, the fire behind him burning low. He had turned 40 that week, though the number meant little to a man who had long stopped counting time by years. He had built an empire out of steel and finance, but tonight, the silence in his mansion was louder than any applause he had ever received. A glass of whiskey rested untouched beside a stack of business journals he no longer read. The clock ticked, steady and cruel. Lightning flashed, and for a brief second, the reflection in the window showed a stranger, tired eyes, sharp jawline, and a loneliness that even billions could not disguise. The world called him a genius. He knew himself only as a man who had once killed the woman he loved. The thunder rolled again, and this time, there was another sound, soft but clear. Knock, knock. Ethan froze. The storm screamed outside, and yet the knock came again. Frantic now. He stood slowly, his heart uneasy. No one ever came here. The gates were always locked. The road was long, steep, and private. When he opened the heavy oak door, the wind nearly ripped it from his hand. A woman stood on the porch, soaked to the bone, shivering. Her hair clung to her face, her coat dripping water onto the marble floor. She looked terrified, and yet her eyes were steady. "Please," she gasped. "My car. It broke down on the road. I saw the lights. I just need shelter until the storm passes." Ethan hesitated. He had not let a stranger into his home in years. The instinct to shut the door was strong, but so was the echo of his late fiancé's voice. "You cannot save everyone, Ethan, but you can start with one person." He stepped aside. "Come in." The woman stumbled in, hugging a small knitted scarf close to her chest. Rain pooled at her feet. She looked around the vast room, its walls lined with books and portraits of long-dead Vales. The firelight painted her face in trembling gold. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I did not know anyone lived this far out." "Most people do not," Ethan replied quietly, closing the door against the raging wind. "You are lucky I heard you." She managed a faint smile. "Lucky is not a word I have heard in a while." He gestured toward the fireplace. "You should warm up. I will get a towel." As Ethan disappeared down the hall, she glanced around. Everything about the mansion was immaculate, yet lifeless, as if time had frozen. On the grand piano in the corner, she noticed a thin layer of dust, except for one clean spot where fingers had once pressed down a single key. She brushed her fingertips over it, almost reverently, then quickly pulled back when she heard his footsteps returning. He handed her a towel, his gaze cautious but curious. "What is your name?" "This witch. We shamed founded it. Clara," she said softly. "Clara Moore." "Ethan Vale," he answered, out of habit, then almost regretted it. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but she said nothing. He could tell she knew. Everyone once knew his name, the billionaire who vanished after tragedy. She wrapped the towel around her shoulders, trembling less now. The fire crackled between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, a different silence grew, one that felt strangely alive. Ethan looked at her again. The way her eyes followed the flames, the way her hands clutched the scarf as if it were something sacred. "You should stay until morning," he said finally. "The roads will be flooded." "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not want to trouble you." "You already have," he said quietly, almost to himself. She glanced at him, uncertain if he was joking. He was not. For years, no one had crossed that threshold. No one had broken the quiet penance he had built. Yet this stranger, with her wet hair and trembling voice, had stepped inside as if she had been meant to all along. Ethan turned away, hiding the conflict in his eyes. He did not know it yet, but this storm, the one that had driven her to his door, was not the disaster. It was the beginning. The rain did not stop until morning. By the time sunlight crept through the tall windows, the storm had left the coastline scarred and quiet. Ethan stood in the doorway of the library, watching the woman asleep on the couch near the fire. Her hair had dried into soft curls, her breathing steady. The scarf she had carried was folded neatly beside her like a fragile memory. He had not seen another person sleep in this house for 5 years. Not since the night of the crash. He remembered the sound of twisted metal, the way her hand slipped from his. Guilt had a way of living in silence, and Ethan had built walls around that silence until it became his only companion. Clara stirred, blinking awake. For a moment, confusion crossed her face, then relief. "I am sorry," she said, sitting up quickly. "I must have fallen asleep." "It is fine," Ethan replied. "You needed rest. The roads are still closed." She looked toward the window, where fog rolled over the cliffs. "It is beautiful here," she murmured. "Lonely, but beautiful." He nodded once. "That is an accurate description." Clara smiled faintly, trying to ease the tension. "Do you live here alone?" "Yes," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "It was easier that way." She did not push for more. Instead, she walked toward the piano she had noticed last night. The surface gleamed in the morning light. One single sheet of blank music paper lay on the stand. "Do you play?" she asked. "Not anymore. That is a shame," she said softly, pressing one key. The sound lingered, warm and haunting. "Music makes the silence easier to bear." Her words struck him like a forgotten truth. She spoke with the calm of someone who had known loss, but refused to be defined by it. He found himself asking, "What do you do, Clara?" "I teach music," she answered, a trace of pride and sadness in her voice. "Or at least I used to. The school closed last month. Budget cuts." Ethan studied her. She did not speak like someone defeated. There was quiet strength beneath the gentleness. "So, what brought you out here?" "I was driving home from a friend's wedding," she said. "The storm came fast. My car slid off the road, right into a ditch. I was lucky to find your lights." "Is life lucky?" he repeated, though part of him wondered if luck was too small a word for the timing of her arrival. Clara sat back down near the fire. "I do not mean to intrude, Mr. Vale. Once the weather clears, I will be gone." He wanted to tell her she could stay a little longer, but the words caught in his throat. He had forgotten how to invite someone into his world. "Instead," he said, "you should eat before you leave." He left the room and returned with a tray of fresh coffee, eggs, and toast he had made himself. When she looked surprised, he shrugged lightly. "Old habits from the years before I could afford chefs." They ate in silence, interrupted only by the sound of the fire and the distant crash of waves. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel like punishment. When she finished, Clara stood and smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Vale, for the food, for the shelter. This prothers when Mary Wyber at Jennery." He met her gaze. "You do not have to thank me." "Yes, I do," she said. "You opened your door. That means something." He did not respond, but when she moved to leave, he noticed she had forgotten her scarf. He picked it up, feeling the rough wool between his fingers. "You left this?" he said. She took it gently. "It was my mother's," she explained. "She used to say it would keep me safe in storms." Ethan looked at her, something soft flickering behind his tired eyes. "Then maybe it brought you here." She smiled again, and for a brief second, the house seemed less empty. When the wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of salt and rain, Ethan realized the strangest thing of all. For the first time in years, he did not want the silence back. By afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving the cliffs washed clean under a pale gray sky. Clara stood by the window, her scarf wrapped around her shoulders again, looking out at the restless sea. Ethan watched her from the doorway, wondering why the sight of her, there small, calm, alive, felt like something he had been waiting for without knowing it. She turned when she felt his gaze. "It is strange," she said quietly. "After a storm, everything looks softer, even the broken things." Ethan crossed the room slowly. "Storms do not break things," he said. "They just reveal what was already weak." She studied him for a moment. "Maybe," she said, "but sometimes they reveal what can still be saved." The words lingered between them. He looked away first, unsettled by how easily she seemed to read him. No one had dared speak to him that way in years. When the wind rattled the windows again, Clara shivered. It is colder than I thought, she murmured. Without thinking, Ethan reached for the coat draped over the chair and handed it to her. Here, he said. Take this. She hesitated. You will freeze. I will manage, he replied. It is not the first storm I have lived through. Clara smiled faintly and slipped her arms into the coat. It hung too large on her, the sleeves covering her hands. She looked almost fragile inside it. Thank you, she said. Something inside Ethan shifted at that simple gratitude. For 5 years, his mansion had been filled with expensive silence, but her voice carried warmth that no amount of money could buy. They spent the afternoon clearing the debris that the storm had left around the property. Clara insisted on helping, even when he told her she did not need to. She gathered fallen branches, brushed rainwater off the porch, and laughed once when a gust of wind tried to steal her scarf. Ethan had forgotten what laughter sounded like. As dusk approached, he started a fire in the outdoor pit near the cliff. Clara joined him, rubbing her hands for warmth. The sky had turned a deep indigo, streaked with the last traces of gold. Below them, waves crashed against the rocks in rhythmic defiance. It is beautiful, she said softly. I used to sit on the roof of my apartment during storms, just to listen. It made me feel small but alive. Ethan stared into the fire. I stopped listening a long time ago. She glanced at him. You could start again. He almost smiled. You make that sound simple. Sometimes it is, she said. You just have to want to hear something again. Her words pressed against a part of him he had buried deep. He thought of the night his fiancée died, how he had sworn never to feel anything that deep again. But now, sitting beside this stranger, the silence inside him did not feel safe anymore. It felt heavy, suffocating. When the fire burned low, Clara stood, brushing ash from her hands. I should go check my car, she said. Maybe it can still start. The road is still slick, he said, standing with her. Wait until morning. She nodded, too polite to argue, but the weariness in her eyes told him she had nowhere else to go. He hesitated, then said quietly, There is a guest room upstairs. It is warmer than the couch. Clara looked surprised. You do not have to. I know, he interrupted. But I want to. For a long moment, she searched his face as if trying to see the truth behind the offer. Finally, she nodded. Thank you, Ethan. When she walked past him toward the stairs, her fingers brushed his hand by accident. It was barely a touch, but it sent a current through him stronger than the storm had the night before. He stood still long after she disappeared down the hallway, the scent of rain and salt still clinging to the air. Outside, the sea roared against the cliffs, but inside the mansion, something quieter had begun to rise, a sound Ethan had not heard in years. Hope. That night, the mansion felt different. The same corridors that once echoed only with the sound of rain now carried a softer hum, as if the house itself knew it was no longer empty. Ethan walked past the guest room and paused outside the door. Light spilled faintly from beneath it. He could hear Clara humming a simple tune, slow and wistful, like something a child might remember from a long time ago. He leaned against the wall, listening. The melody stirred an ache in him that words could not reach. It reminded him of another night, another voice, and the promise he had never kept. He stepped away quietly before the memories could swallow him again. In the morning, Clara was already awake. She stood in the kitchen wearing one of his shirts, sleeves rolled up, making coffee. The sight startled him. It was such an ordinary thing, but in his house, ordinary felt extraordinary. I hope you do not mind, she said, smiling when she saw him. I found everything neatly labeled, so I assumed you would not starve if someone used your kitchen. He chuckled softly, the sound strange in his own ears. You assumed right. They shared breakfast. Simple but warm. She asked about the storm damage, and when he mentioned a fallen branch blocking the side path, she offered to help again. Together they cleared the path, their hands brushing occasionally as they worked. Each touch felt heavier than it should have, filled with something neither dared to name. When they returned inside, Clara noticed the piano again. She hesitated, then sat down and touched the keys. May I? Ethan nodded. She began to play. The notes drifted through the room like sunlight after rain, gentle, patient, healing. For the first time in years, Ethan did not feel the need to escape the sound. He stood beside her, watching her hands move with quiet confidence. When she finished, the last note lingered, trembling in the still air. That was beautiful, he said quietly. It is called When the Storm Ends. she replied. I wrote it years ago but never finished. Why not? She looked up at him, her eyes soft but tired. I guess I was waiting for the right ending. Something inside him tightened. Maybe you have found it, he said, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. Before she could reply, a knock echoed through the hall, sharp, unexpected. Ethan's expression darkened instantly. No one ever came here uninvited. He opened the door to find two men in dark suits standing on the porch, rain still dripping from their coats. Mr. Vale, one of them said, his tone polite but firm. We have been trying to reach you. The board is demanding your presence. The media is asking questions about your absence. They are calling it a disappearance. Ethan's jaw tightened. I am not missing, he said coldly. I am retired. The man's eyes flicked past him to Clara, who stood quietly by the piano. And this must be the reason you have gone off the grid. That is none of your business, Ethan snapped. He slammed the door shut and turned away, anger flaring in his chest. Clara looked startled. I am sorry, she said softly. I did not mean to cause trouble. Ron statement. You did not, he said quickly. He stopped, realizing he could not explain the world she had just glimpsed. A world of money, control, and expectations that never forgave weakness. Clara looked at him for a long moment. You are not the man they describe, she said finally. They do not see what I see. He exhaled slowly, his voice almost a whisper. Then, what do you see? A man who forgot how to live, she said, but not how to care. The silence that followed was fragile and full. She smiled faintly and turned back to the piano, pressing one soft note that seemed to dissolve the tension in the air. That night, when Ethan lay awake listening to the waves crash against the cliffs, he thought of her words. He had built walls to protect himself, but Clara had walked through them with nothing more than a song. And for the first time in years, he wondered if he wanted those walls to fall. The next morning arrived gray and cold. A thin mist drifted through the cliffs, and the sea below was calm for the first time in days. Ethan brewed coffee in silence while Clara folded her coat near the fireplace. Her scarf, still faintly damp from the storm, lay on the arm of the chair. You do not have to leave yet, he said quietly, watching the steam rise from his cup. Clara looked up, surprised. You have already done enough, Ethan. I should not overstay my welcome. He wanted to tell her that her presence had not been a burden, that her laughter had chased the ghosts from his halls. But he only nodded. At least let me drive you into town. The roads are safer now. She smiled, gentle but distant. I will manage. Besides, I think you have things to take care of. There's AZS. He followed her gaze to the unopened envelope resting on the counter, one of many delivered over the years by his company's lawyers, reminders of a world he had abandoned. The sight filled him with a weight he could not explain. Clara slipped her scarf around her neck and said softly, You cannot hide forever, you know. The world still turns, even if you stop watching it. He met her eyes, and for the first time in years, he did not look away. Maybe I am tired of watching it alone. She said nothing, but her smile faltered, as if she was afraid of what that meant. Outside, her car waited, half buried in mud from the storm. Ethan insisted on helping. Together they pushed it free, their hands and clothes smeared with dirt and laughter. When the engine finally roared to life, Clara looked at him through the open window. I guess this is goodbye, she said. For now, he replied. She hesitated, then reached for something from the seat beside her. It was a small, folded sheet of music, the unfinished piece she had played on his piano. She handed it to him. I think you should finish it. You understand storms better than anyone. Ethan unfolded the paper, his eyes tracing the last line of blank staves. I do not know how to end it. Then do what I do, she said softly. Listen. The car pulled away, leaving him standing in the drive, the music trembling in his hands. He watched until the taillights vanished beyond the trees, then turned back toward the mansion that suddenly felt too quiet again. That night, unable to sleep, he sat before the piano. The fire had died down to embers, the room wrapped in shadows. He stared at the empty measures on the page and began to play. The notes were hesitant at first, searching, like steps on new ground. But slowly they found their rhythm, low, deep, and human. When he reached the part she had written, he heard her voice in his mind, calm and warm. You just have to want to hear something again. His fingers moved faster, filling the silence with sound, until the house itself seemed to breathe. For the first time since the accident, Ethan played through the pain instead of running from it. The melody carried him somewhere far beyond guilt, into the possibility of peace. When the final note faded, he closed his eyes. He could almost hear Clara's laughter in the echo. The next morning, sunlight poured across the cliffs, brighter than before. Ethan stood at the window, holding the finished sheet of music. Below the title, When the Storm Ends, he had written one final line. For Clara, he did not know if he would ever see her again, but he knew the silence no longer owned him. Somewhere beyond the sea, the world was waiting, and for the first time in 5 years, Ethan Vale was ready to step back into it. A week passed before Ethan saw her again. The storm had left the roads broken and the town quiet, but something inside him refused to return to his old isolation. Each morning he played the melody she had left behind, and each night he walked to the cliffs, waiting without admitting he was waiting. On the seventh day, as the sun fell behind the sea, headlights appeared in the distance. A small blue car climbed the narrow road to the mansion. Ethan's pulse quickened, an unfamiliar rhythm stirring in his chest. When the engine stopped, he was already at the door. Clara stood there, wind in her hair, holding a brown envelope against her chest. "You did not expect me to keep away, did you?" she said, smiling. "I was starting to think you had forgotten the way," he replied. She stepped inside, brushing raindrops from her coat. "I tried, but something told me you would need to hear this in person." She handed him the envelope. "It is from the school board. They reopened the music program. They asked if I could come back to teach, and I said yes, but on one condition." "What condition?" Ethan asked. "That they start a new scholarship for underprivileged kids. I named it after someone who reminded me why kindness still matters." Ethan opened the envelope and read the heading, "The Vale Music Foundation." For a long moment he could not speak. "You used my name," she nodded. "You gave me shelter when I had nothing. This is my way of giving it back." He looked at her, his throat tightening. "You did not need my permission." "I did not," she said gently. "But I wanted your blessing. It never meant." He set the letter down and took a step closer. "You have it. All of it." The silence between them felt different now. Alive, charged, like the pause before a note resolves. Clara walked toward the piano and noticed the sheet of music sitting there. Completed. "You finished it," she said softly. "I tried," he replied, "but I think it was always your song." She ran her fingers across the notes. "No, Ethan, it is ours." He sat beside her, and together they began to play. The melody rose and swelled through the room, echoing against the stone walls. Every note seemed to tell their story: the storm, the night she knocked, the silence that turned into music. When the final chord faded, Clara turned to him. "You should come to the concert next month. The first student recital for the foundation. I want you to hear what your kindness started." "I will be there," he said. "You have my word." They in Rotherwayne, the Superterragen. Clara smiled, then stood. "Then I should go before the roads flood again." She hesitated at the door. "Thank you, Ethan, for believing in me." He watched her leave once more, but this time the loneliness did not crush him. Instead, it carried a strange peace. He sat back at the piano, replaying the melody they had just shared. Outside, the sea was calm, reflecting the pale light of the moon. Later that night, he received a message from his company. The board wanted him to return. For years, he would have ignored it, but this time he replied with a single line. "Let us discuss how the Vale Foundation can sponsor the arts." It was the first step of many, and it felt right. As dawn crept over the horizon, Ethan stood on the balcony with the wind brushing through his hair. The waves rolled steadily below, no longer violent, no longer wild. He realized that storms did not always destroy. Sometimes they delivered what was missing. And somewhere down the coast, Clara was probably humming that same song again. 2 weeks later, Ethan arrived at the city for the first time in nearly 5 years. The sound of car horns and footsteps was jarring after so much silence, but beneath the noise was a pulse that matched the rhythm of his own heart. He walked through the downtown streets toward the old concert hall that had been closed for renovation. Now it gleamed with new banners that read, "The Vale Music Foundation, Opening Night Recital." He had not told Clara he was coming. Part of him wanted to see her surprise. The other part wanted to prove to himself that he could face the world again. Inside, the hall smelled of polished wood and fresh paint. Rows of seats filled with parents, students, and reporters whispered in anticipation. When the lights dimmed, Ethan took a quiet seat in the back. The curtain lifted. A group of children stepped onto the stage, each holding a violin or flute or clarinet. In the center stood Clara, graceful and calm, her hair pinned neatly, a soft smile lighting her face. Ethan felt his breath catch. She looked at home there, surrounded by sound and hope. When the first note filled the room, he felt the music vibrate through his chest. It was the melody they had written together, When the Storm Ends. But now it had grown woven with new harmonies, young voices, and the laughter of life beginning again. Ethan's eyes stung as he listened. Every note seemed to tell their story. The rain, the firelight, the silence, the rediscovery of warmth. At the end of the performance, the audience rose in applause. Clara bowed, scanning the crowd, and when her gaze found him in the back row, she froze for just a moment. Then she smiled a small, knowing smile that reached her eyes. It was all the welcome he needed. After the concert, Ethan waited until the hall emptied. Clara found him near the exit, holding a bouquet one of the students had given her. "You came," she said, her voice soft but bright. "I told you I would," he replied. "I did not want to miss the first storm that ended." She laughed gently. "It is strange, is it not, how something broken can turn into music?" "Maybe storms do not end," Ethan said. "They just change their sound." Clara tilted her head, studying him. "You look different. Lighter." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I am finally learning how to live again." They walked outside together, the city air cool and damp after a light drizzle. Streetlights glowed across puddles, scattering gold reflections along the sidewalk. Clara stopped beside his car. "There is something I wanted to tell you," she said. "The foundation is getting attention. People are donating. One of the sponsors asked if you would attend the press dinner next week." Ethan hesitated. "You want me to stand in front of cameras again?" "I want them to see the man who made all this possible," she said gently. "Not the billionaire they wrote about. The real one." He looked at her, the way her eyes carried both strength and trust, and felt something in him settle. "Then I will go," he said. "For you." She smiled, and for a moment, they stood in silence, the city lights flickering around them. Then Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her mother's knitted scarf, the same one she had worn that first night. She placed it in his hands. "Keep it," she said, "for luck." Ethan stared at the scarf, its familiar thread still smelling faintly of rain and salt. "Are you sure?" "I will not need it anymore," she said softly. "You taught me how to walk through storms." He folded the scarf carefully, holding it as though it were something precious. When she stepped closer, the distance between them disappeared. He wanted to speak, to tell her everything that had been building inside him since that night, but the words caught in his throat. So he simply said, "Thank you." She smiled again. "Do not thank me, Ethan. Just promise me one thing." "What is that?" "When the next storm comes, do not hide from it." He nodded slowly, his voice low. "Not anymore." As she turned to leave, Ethan watched her walk into the light rain, her reflection shimmering in the wet street. He pressed the scarf to his chest and realized that some storms do not destroy, they guide you home. The following week, the city buzzed with talk about the upcoming charity gala hosted by the Vale Music Foundation. It would be the first time Ethan Vale appeared publicly in years. Reporters called it his return, but for Ethan, it felt more like a new beginning. The invitation had gone out quietly, yet the response was overwhelming. Donors, executives, and artists all wanted to witness the revival of a man once believed lost to grief. On the evening of the event, the grand ballroom shimmered beneath chandeliers. Musicians tuned their instruments, waiters hurried between tables, and banners of the foundation hung proudly along the walls. Ethan stood near the entrance, dressed in a classic black suit, the knitted scarf tucked discreetly into his coat pocket. His reflection in the mirror startled him, not the tired, broken recluse from years ago, but someone present, alive. Clara arrived moments later, wearing a deep blue gown that caught the light like calm water after rain. The crowd seemed to part when she entered. Ethan's gaze found her instantly. She smiled when she saw him, a quiet acknowledgement that only they understood. "You made it," she said when she reached him. "I told you I would not hide anymore," he replied. "You look extraordinary." "Thank you," she said, glancing toward the stage. "They are waiting for you. It is your foundation, after all." He laughed softly. "Ours," he corrected. As the evening began, Ethan stood at the microphone while the audience hushed. He took a slow breath, his voice steady but warm. 5 years ago, I thought my life had ended in a storm. I lost someone I loved, and I built walls to keep the world away. But then, one night, someone knocked on my door in the rain. She reminded me that even in darkness, kindness still finds a way in. The crowd listened, moved by the quiet sincerity in his tone. He continued, "Tonight this foundation is not about money or power. It is about second chances for those who dream, for those who have lost, and for those who still believe that music can heal." Applause rose like a tide. Clara, standing near the stage, wiped away a tear she tried to hide. After the speeches, the orchestra began to play. The opening notes were familiar to the melody of "When the Storm Ends." Ethan turned to find Clara approaching with a microphone in hand. "We wrote this together," she said to the audience. "But tonight, it belongs to everyone who has ever found hope after loss. And lot of the data, Brett. Good place says, in dollars." They performed side by side, her voice blending with the orchestra while he played the piano. The music soared, filling every corner of the hall. When the final chord faded, silence fell before thunderous applause erupted. Ethan stood and turned to her. Under the shimmering lights, surrounded by clapping hands and smiling faces, something inside him finally broke free. He reached for Clara's hand and said softly, "You were the one who ended my storm." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "No, Ethan, you ended it yourself. I just knocked on the door." The audience erupted again, but Ethan barely heard them. For the first time, the noise of the world did not scare him. It sounded like life, messy, loud, and beautiful. Later, as the guests mingled and cameras flashed, Ethan led Clara to the balcony. The city stretched below, lights glowing like a constellation. The wind carried the faintest hint of rain. "Another storm coming," she said with a soft laugh. He smiled, pulling the scarf from his pocket and wrapping it gently around her shoulders. "Then we will face it together." They stood there in silence, the echoes of applause fading behind them, the music still lingering in their hearts. For Ethan Vale, the storm that once defined him had finally turned into a song. The following spring, the cliffs of Maine bloomed again. The mansion that had once stood silent was now alive, with sound music, laughter, and the rhythm of rebuilding. The Vale Music Foundation had grown faster than anyone expected. Every week, children from across the state came to learn, play, and find their voice within those stone walls that had once belonged only to silence. Ethan stood by the window of his library, watching a group of students unload instruments from a van. The air smelled of salt and wildflowers. Clara's voice echoed faintly from the garden below, calm and steady as she guided a young pianist through her first scales. He smiled without realizing it. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to grief. It had become a sanctuary for hope. Clara entered the room quietly, holding a small box tied with a ribbon. "You have been working since sunrise," she said. "Take a break before the ceremony starts." He turned toward her. "Old habits die hard." She handed him the box. "Consider this a reminder to start new ones." Inside was a silver key attached to a tag that read Studio B. "It is finished?" he asked, surprised. Clara nodded. "The new music studio is ready. The students wanted to name it after you, but I convinced them otherwise." "What did you call it?" She smiled. "The Storm Room, because that is where all this began." "Only why?" He laughed softly, the sound carrying warmth. "You always know how to turn my past into something worth keeping." "That is what partners do," she said, her eyes gleaming. Ethan's gaze lingered on her hand, the sunlight catching the simple ring that now rested there. It had been 3 months since the gala, the night he asked her to stay, not as a guest, but as his equal, his companion. She had said yes without hesitation. The press had called it the love story no one saw coming, but for Ethan and Clara, it was simply two hearts finding their way home. Outside, the first guests arrived for the Foundation's anniversary concert. Among them were donors, musicians, and former students. A young boy ran up the stairs, breathless and excited. "Mr. Vale, Miss Clara, everyone is waiting for you." Ethan exchanged a glance with her and nodded. Together, they stepped outside into the golden afternoon. The garden had been transformed into an open-air stage. Strings of lights swayed above, and banners of "When the Storm Ends" fluttered in the breeze. The same song that had once been a private echo between two lost souls now belonged to everyone. Clara took her place at the piano while Ethan addressed the crowd. "A year ago, I lived behind walls of my own making," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I believed silence was safer than feeling. But someone knocked on my door during a storm, and she taught me that life does not stop when the world falls apart. It begins again when we choose to open the door." Applause filled the garden. Clara's fingers touched the keys, and the melody rose once more. This time Ethan joined her, their hands brushing briefly, perfectly in sync. The students joined in, their voices pure and bright. The music swelled, carried by the wind over the cliffs and out to the endless sea. As the final note faded, Ethan turned to Clara and whispered, "I used to think storms were meant to destroy." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Sometimes they are just meant to bring two people together." The crowd stood, clapping, cheering, and somewhere between the sound of waves and music, Ethan leaned in and kissed her, the first kiss of his life, and the only one he would ever need. The camera of the world might have captured the moment, but for them, it was simple. The storm had ended, the silence was gone, and love, quiet, patient, and real, had finally found its home.